Good day, everyone, and welcome to this May edition of the APPA Agora, a free monthly public event featuring leading philosophical practitioners. I'm Lou Marinoff, your host, and it's a pleasure to welcome Rick Repetti, this month's featured guest. Rick Repetti is professor of philosophy at CUNY Kingsborough, a vice president of APPA, and a certified philosophical counselor. Also trained as a Gestalt therapist, a certified life coach, and CBT practitioner, and a multiple decades practitioner and instructor of yoga and meditation. His most recent publication is the edited collection, the Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation, 2022. His other publications include 3 books, the monograph Buddhism, Meditation, and Free Will, Routledge 2019, the edited collection, Buddhist Perspectives on Free Will, Agentless Agency, Routledge 2017, and the monograph, The Counterfactual Theory of Free Will, Lambert Academic Press 2010, and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters in edited collections. Rick is also Chief Philosophy Officer for a tech startup company named KnowledgeCoin.io, developing a decentralized truth validation platform on the blockchain. Former fellow of the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society, he leads weekly meditations for CUNY and for the Vervaeke Foundation, and is a founding member of the CUNY Mindfulness and Contemplative Studies Initiative. Rick has appeared on dozens of podcasts, including Voices with Vervaeke. He's also a 4th degree black belt in Shotokan karate and a former marathoner. I must also apologize that a technical glitch interfered with the first part of today's recording, so we'll pick up the action as Rick discusses Buddhism and free will.
What the hell happened to Rick?
So Buddhism happened to Rick, and also Gestalt. What about my last question? And then I want to open the floor. We have a lot of people here who may want to interact with you, so I won't deprive them. How did Gestalt get into the mix with you?
Yeah, well, Ram Dass was favorable. He spoke favorably on numerous occasions about Gestalt, and he would share certain kind of psychotechnologies that he learned from his experience and his encounters with Gestalt, certain little exercises and whatnot. So I had a favorable attitude toward that. And when I was going through a divorce, I thought I could use some therapeutic assistance talking to someone. And a friend of mine who I went to grad school with, after she got her PhD, she became, she went through the training at the Gestalt Center in New York, the Gestalt Center for Psychotherapy and Training, and became one of the, not only a counselor, but a teacher, one of the faculty members in that program. And so when I was looking for a therapist, I called her up. They brought me in for an intake interview and hooked me up with somebody who she thought would be a good fit for me. And I fell in love with the work. And my therapist thought that he said that I was like the most model client that he had ever had, that he thought that this Gestalt work came very naturally to me. And at one point he said, you know, we do this training for the students twice a year, in the winter and in the summer, where it's a weekend retreat and it's a kind of immersion in just the practicum, you know, so all the students who are first year students at the end of the year, then they can play the role of therapist for the first time. And so you would have to be the client, you play the role as a client, but you could also, all the faculty participate in it. And I think you're like, what did he say? 80% cured of whatever your issues were that you brought in with me, which was just me trying to figure out how to deal with my divorce. And he said, my teacher told me when I was about 80% done, time for you to move on and solve the rest on your own. So he said, I'm releasing you. But if you want to continue, you might want to come to this retreat so that you could just experience how other Gestalt therapists are, because we're all different. We all have our own little teachings and skills and, you know, toolkits and whatnot, and different personalities. And I think you could absorb it all like a sponge and, you know, see what it's like for you. So I went, and because I was going through this divorce, I had my dissertation just kind of got frozen on me. I was in dissertation writing mode, but I had been stuck for quite a while. Over the course of this weekend, I wrote like 35 pages for my dissertation for the first time in like a year or something like that. The Gestalt just kind of opened me up, and I fell in love with it, and I decided to join the program to get the training. And I did 2 years out of the 3-year program. If I would have finished the 3rd year on time, I would have been able to call myself a psychotherapist in New York. But in between the 2nd and the 3rd year, New York State changed the rules about the use of the word psychotherapist.
Right.
Said you can't do that unless you have a PhD in psychology or an MSW, Master's in Social Work. And that like the school wasn't so sure about how difficult it would be for me to be grandfathered in, because I had only had clients for 1 year. In the 2nd year, you could have clients and under supervision. And at the exact same time, I got hired full-time at Kingsborough Community College in CUNY. It cost money to go to that school. There was no guarantees that I'd get grandfathered in. I needed to focus on getting tenure. So I just stopped following through with the Gestalt thing. Yeah.
Well, you could only pursue one career at a time, actually, full time. I mean, you were trying to pursue 2 careers at a time, sounds like.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm glad you got through the one, but you never let go of all these other skill sets. One more question, and I'll open the mic. I wanted to ask you about free will, not in a technical, academic, analytic sense, but in just a quotidian, everyday way. You are a soft determinist. You are a compatibilist. How would you classify yourself if you had to?
Yeah. Well, look, I'll make one distinction right off the bat. One is what positions I will argue for in my academic professional work. And that's that soft compatibilist thing, which I'll describe in a moment. The other one is my personal uncertainty about the subject. So one of the mystical experiences that led me to work on free will was not just one, but many very complexly precognitive dreams that made me think that I knew the future in ways that couldn't be dismissed the way that science normally dismisses precognitive experiences, which is to say that, what about all the misses? You counting a hit, you're going to get four aces every now and then. The cards are shuffled, same, but like these things were, to me, were so multiply improbable that explanation didn't count. So I thought there's something wrong with the conception of time or necessity and agency. Like I'm confused. How could I have known about something that was going to happen, let's just say a month or a year in advance, that was incredibly complex, that involves so many different agents making so many different decisions between when I knew it and when it happened? How is that possible unless you can get outside of time? That kind of thing is what interested me in free will to begin with. But all the academic reading that I did on that is very little that touches on that. Very little. It's just logical fatalism and things like that. So in my agency and my phenomenology and my experience in my life, I feel like I have a tremendous degree of agency. So I do believe that I have practical free will. I'm uncertain ultimately about the metaphysics of it, the nature of time and that sort of thing. But I think that most of the people who argue against free will are making a logical argument that, like, if determinism is true, you can't have free will. Or if indeterminism is true, you can't have free will. So I think that that's a flawed logical argument. So I'm making a logical argument. I'm not making the factual one, right? I will say, I believe that I have free will, but I'm uncertain about it. It's kind of like William James's attitude. Right? One of my choices is to believe that I have free will, and that seems to make me effective as an agent. But what does it mean to say, well, the 2 arguments that get united in what's called hard incompatibilism is, if determinism is true, you have no free will. That's called hard determinism, if determinism is true. And the idea is, if that's the case, then A causes B, B causes C. The Big Bang caused your decision, from the beginning till now. And you couldn't have done otherwise. Only one alternative was actually possible. And if you couldn't have done otherwise, you don't have free will. That's hard determinism. Hard indeterminism is the view that if there was any indeterminism, quantum indeterminacy, or any kind of indeterminacy whatsoever in your brain or in your decision-making process, then that's totally random and chaotic, and you can't control the outcome of a random process. So it's not up to you, and therefore you're not free. You're not the author of that experience. So, and both of those are incompatibilisms. Free will is incompatible with determinism. It's incompatible with indeterminism. Unite them and they call that hard incompatibilism. So I just take the opposite of both of those, and I kind of flip the reasoning between them so that, like, if, what do you call, a random process can't be under your control, an unnoticed implication is that a non-random process can be under your control, right? And if you're being unable to do otherwise means that you don't have free will, then you're being able to do otherwise under indeterminism means that you do. So I say that I kind of just flip the argument, and I say that, in both cases, free will is possible, right? I just flip the entailments.
That's great. And did they allow this? Was this part of your thesis actually at the grad center?
Yeah, this was my dissertation. And actually, two really world-renowned philosophers of free will were my outside examiners, Harry Frankfurt and Galen Strawson. And I was critiquing something in Frankfurt's account in my dissertation. He was there in my oral defense. And the three-person panel, the internal committee for my dissertation, they were trying to critique me, but Frankfurt actually came to my defense and argued in my favor that they didn't understand my theory. But I was actually improving on it. I found a flaw in his theory, and I was kind of trying to improve on it. Because his theory said that causality is completely irrelevant. And I was saying, well, on one level it is, but on another level, you could actually make a causal model that's consistent with his thing and whatever. And I gave a whole analysis that he liked it. So.
Great. And since usually by convention, the internals defer to the externals, they pretty much had to, and I guess Strawson was in your camp too.
Yes, and I had criticisms of his argument. He has the impossibility argument, which kind of bysteps determinism or indeterminism. I'll give a quick synopsis of it. It goes like this. Regardless of the nature of causation, that's completely irrelevant. Whatever you make a choice, that choice is always a function of or is conditioned by your current mental state. And you can't be completely in control of your current mental state unless you were in control of the previous one, all the way back to some pristine beginning, which could only happen if you could create yourself ex nihilo from nothing. You can't be a causa sui, a self-created being. Therefore, you can't ever be ultimately morally responsible for your choices. And since moral responsibility and free will are, interconnected, you're not really ultimately free. And so my counter argument to him was, well, in Buddhism, we become deconditioned over time. We practice deconditioning our mental states. So you can become deconditioned in such a way that you're not a causa sui, you're kind of uncausa sui, you're uncaused, you're kind of deconditioning yourself. And Strawson liked that argument too.
So you could juxtapose, then you can, I'm assuming you could then juxtapose the position you've already described with the classical Buddhist position that there is free will, but there's no one who is the possessor of it.
Right. Yeah. Kane is a libertarian, Robert Kane, who tries to come up with this model. He had an idea that I plucked in also. I'm very eclectic, and lots of philosophers.
We've noticed, Rick, it's good.
But yeah, a lot of philosophers in the tradition at the grad center, like you can't just pluck one thing from Kant and another thing from Hume, that kind of thing, right? You've got to be a this or a that, But so this is just the way that my mind thinks. But Robert Kane had a model. The libertarian idea about free will is that my mind is not caused by anything, and I'm almost like a prime mover unmoved, right? And so, like the critics say, "Come on, that doesn't make sense. Can you come up with a model where libertarianism could be consistent with science?" And so Robert Kane says, "Well, how about this? When a child has its first moral or torn decision, it's like, Bourdain's ass. If there's a bundle of hay on one side and a thing of water on the other, and is equally thirsty and hungry, and it can't make a decision, it will get frozen and die of starvation, right?" So Kane says, well, maybe in the brain, in a torn decision of an agent that hasn't really enacted any agency yet, like a kid, right? Age 5, 6, 7, whatever, their first torn decision, what if their neural processes get neutralized, and that creates some kind of quantum indeterminacy in the brain, and then the agent collapses like the wave function, right? The agent is enacting its first act as an agent to pick one of those volitions. They're both the agents. So that one of the criticisms is if it's random, it's not the agent's volition. So it's kind of alien. But like Kane said, no, both of them are the agents. They're just in competition. And if they're equal, the agent is making a value in the act of enacting one of them. And that is creating the nature of that agent, et cetera, et cetera. He calls these self-forming acts. And I said, well, we do a combination of self-forming acts and self-unforming acts if we practice meditation. The Buddhist path, the Eightfold Path, right? Right view, right intention, right speech, right action. We're always thinking about, okay, I have these dispositions that are kind of first order that I got from my genetics or my karma or whatever it is, but we try to detach from them. And the teaching says, approve of the ones that lead toward enlightenment, disapprove of the ones that don't. And right, so you're kind of not watering the weeds and they die, and you're watering the new things that are leading toward enlightenment. So I put all those ideas together in my dissertation as a kind of model about how, even the impossibility argument, I flip it, with the self-forming and self-unforming things so that I call it the possibility argument. And yeah.
Well,
So
thank you for that. That's the short answer. Okay. But I would like to open the mic now to our very patient guests and ask anyone who wants to interact with you to please put their hand up. We'll recognize you and invite you to unmute. If anybody has any questions for Rick, certainly a lot that he could be asked. George, yes, please, go ahead.
You're muted, George.
Yeah, George, please unmute.
We have a personal connection.
There you go.
Hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Stolnitz.
Oh, Jerome.
Oh, yes. He was my thesis advisor. Okay. And did you ever read his book on the aesthetic attitude?
No, I never read his book.
Okay. Well, I would encourage you. I would encourage you to do just look at his definition of the aesthetic attitude, because I think it's very close to mindfulness. He defines it as a disinterested and sympathetic attention to any object of awareness for its own sake.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, look at it.
Jerome Stolnitz practically grabbed me by the ear when he was the first philosophy class I took, Intro to Philosophy, and I just so loved it. I was arguing with him all day, every time we were in class. At the end, the course wasn't even halfway over when he said, he practically dragged me by the ear to the honors program, the Lehman Scholars Program, and said, you have to be in this. And I'm teaching a seminar in the Lehman Scholars Program next semester on Plato's Republic, and you have to be in that class. So I said, okay, I joined the program. I got the book. I read it over the summer and I was blown away reading about Plato's forms, because that was that experience that I had. It kind of reminded me when I felt like this kind of understanding of intelligibility that was kind of transconceptual. I remember thinking, that sounds like what I experienced on some level. But then nobody was interested in that. In fact, Stolnitz was surprised that I really loved Plato. He was like, almost nobody likes Plato. Be mindful of who you tell that to. You sound like a real Platonist, Rick. You really believe in Plato's forms? I said, yeah, I think I experienced that.
Okay, thank you very much, George. Okay, Patricia, you please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Patricia.
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to see you and to listen to you. A couple of questions regarding your personal pathway, which I find very, very, very interesting. The first question is, when you were in that state of doubt and crisis, and your divorce one, when you went to look for help into Gestalt, which I find very interesting as well. But why did you choose Gestalt, apart from the advice of your friend, which of course addressed you to the Gestalt psychologist? And what about philosophical counseling in that moment? I mean, had you heard about that? Why didn't you try to look for help into that direction, more connected to philosophy instead of psychology? Which person I think that they can dialogue, but anyway, why? Yeah, that's the first question.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I have another one. So the other one is, during your first experience of yoga and meditation, and also the successive one, the next ones, precognitive status, and did you had those experience just because you could meditate with your help, or you, for example, did you take any? I can't see you anymore, but anyway. Yeah, your image has gone. I don't know why, but anyway.
It's okay,
yeah.
Patricia. We see you. Rick is here. Please ask the second question.
Yeah, okay, sorry. The second question, were you taking any substance? I mean, like mushrooms or LSD? I mean, were you helped with some chemical or natural substance to promote this status or not? Or were just your ability to meditate and to experience this kind of particular meditation status? Or you were, because there were the 70s and the middle of 70s. So I'm asking if you were taking substances as well to favor your experiences. You got it? Yes.
Yes,
okay.
I do.
Both the questions.
Yeah, so the first one, why Gestalt and not philosophical counseling? At the time, I guess this was around 2002, 2003, that I started the Gestalt psychotherapy. It was a couple of years really into my separation, which was an ugly kind of divorce. And I just needed some kind of counseling, some kind of person outside of my range of friends and family members to give me some kind of practical advice on how to deal with the difficulty of the process. And I had a very positive attitude, I said earlier, about Gestalt from Ram Dass, who spoke very highly about it and would bring in certain exercises to our classes and whatnot that he had gotten from Gestalt. And I had read, he'd written certain things about it here and there in his writing. So I had a very favorable attitude about it. Also, before I actually left my marriage, my wife and I at the time decided to go for counseling separately, family counseling. And the therapist, the psychologist was like kind of Freudian, and I just did not connect with his whole mental framework on the whole thing. And I just thought it was absolutely useless. And I remembered having a favorable attitude about Gestalt. I happened to know somebody who I had tremendous respect for, who was like my best friend in grad school, who had become a Gestalt psychotherapist, and she was a teacher at the Center for Gestalt in New York City. So I reached out to her because I had this antecedent positive view about Gestalt, which I thought, whatever I had read about it, Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt, he was also a kind of eclectic philosophical guy who brought in a lot of stuff from Asian philosophy. And so I had an affinity for that, A, and B, I didn't know anything about philosophical counseling yet. I only found out about it afterwards. I got hired full-time, at a certain point, that when I was in between the second and the third year in Gestalt psychotherapy, full-time at Kingsborough Community College, which is part of City University of New York. And one of my colleagues there was, he just published a book, which was almost like a kind of spiritual / existential / philosophical autobiography. And I loved the book. And I remember asking him, I've never read anything in philosophy like this, and you're a Western philosopher and everything. Can you recommend some other books to me? One of the books he recommended was Plato, Not Prozac. And I devoured that book. And it was shortly after that I connected with Lou. I contacted him, asked him if he'd come and give a talk at my college. His book, The Middle Way, or something. Is that the title? The
Yeah,
Middle Way?
Rick, I had a wonderful time
It just came out.
yeah.
So I didn't know. If I had known at the time, I would have contacted Lou and asked him to hook me up with some philosophical counselor, because that's really what I needed. My problems weren't psychological in nature. They were like about values and just how to deal with certain kinds of changes in my life path and things like that. The Gestalt, though, because they come out of this tradition where a lot of their work, it's not like Freudian or whatever. It's much more informed by things like Zen, being in the moment, getting the client to explore their felt sense while they're discussing things. It's just there's a kind of multitude of ways that they go about things. It worked a lot for me, and I found it really resonant with me as a person. That's why I pursued that, thinking that might be a second career. Like I said, my friend got her PhD and then went into that. Philosophers will often go into something else. So I just thought, let me do it. It just seemed right at the time. Okay, now psychedelics. My memory is not 100% clear about the beginnings of, exactly when I had my first mystical, but I know this. When I was 13, I moved to Brooklyn, and I had a relative who helped us my family find an apartment. We had lived in Queens for 10 years before that. And she was a kind of hippie pothead. And so she turned me on to pot. And I know I started smoking pot when I was 13. And I had that mystical experience when I was 15. I do believe that it was before I tried any psychedelics. I think pot was the strongest thing that I had ever tried. But it was after that mystical experience that I found books like Be Here Now with Ram Dass speaking favorably about psychedelics and all this. And so there was a period of maybe a half a year to a year at most, where I was playing around with psychedelics and meditation and all of that at the same time, before I finally realized one of Hilda's quotes was of some yogi. I forget who it was, but she said something like this in one of her lectures: psychedelics are like plastic grapes and God is like wine. Right. And so I thought, oh yeah, I need the real stuff, and Ram Dass would say in his book, Be Here Now, that like his acid trips and all that put him in like some kind of wonderful thing, but it would wear off and he wasn't changed. And so that's why he got into this other stuff. And so, I eventually decided, okay, I'm going to plunge into this. Most of my mystical experiences, though, were after the psychedelics.
Okay.
Not during.
So Rick, what we used to say back in the day, that if you remember,
You weren't
there, so none of us remember. A lot of us remember talking to God, but we can't remember what God said anymore. But you and Ram Dass and Aldous Huxley and many others who shall go unnamed on this podcast definitely were back in the day going to experience all that was available, including what came out of Owsley's lab. And I think that it did a lot of people a lot of good. It opened a lot of minds. It wore off, so we then sought more enduring and more durable ways of attaining that kind of oneness. But It sounds like it worked pretty well for you. Is that okay, Patricia? Did you get the answers you were after? I think so.
Absolutely, both of them. Thank you very much.
Robert's hand is up. So please go ahead, Robert.
Yes, I will put a little bit difficult question about free will. This is interesting, and I say hello to Rick. But I had my experience of meditation, but I'm a little bit confused now. I think when one goes to decide to go to meditation, to go into. This is decision by the will. Yeah, yes, by the will. But I think that when I decide to meditate, this is not and this is a question, how much that decision is free. I want to meditate. For what? For what purpose? Why I want to meditate? Is this decision free? And maybe through meditation, we attain in some moment freedom, but that is not free will, because there is not one who possesses the will, as Mr. Lu said a little bit before. So how they relate? I don't think that will is free in meditation. Maybe that we are free of will. Maybe we get to the field of freedom without will. That is kind of my experience. I don't know. What do you think, Mr. Rick?
Yeah, no, that's a really good and challenging question, Robert. You're right that it's a challenging question. And I guess it presupposes, or it entails the obvious fact that we have many different conceptions of what does it actually even mean to have free will, right? So Harry Frankfurt, who I mentioned earlier, he has a model where your will is free. He differentiates between freedom of action and freedom of the will. So freedom of action is when you are not chained to a fence or in a cell in a prison, and you're able to act. You can enact your desires, your volitions, your intentions. Whether you're a child or a horse or a person, if you want to run and you're able to run, you've acted on your own volition, so you have freedom of action, right? But if you're imprisoned or something, or chained to a fence, you have limited freedom of action, right? He says freedom of the will is when you have the kind of will that you want to have, right? So, take a case of weakness of will, he says, is when, he makes a distinction between, let's just say, first order desires and second order ones, or base desires and meta desires. Your base desires are desires for objects or experiences. Like I want that car, or I want that ice cream, or I want to have a LSD experience, whatever it is, right? So you have the desire, and a higher order desire or meta desire or second order desire is the object of the desire is itself another desire or intention. Right. So I said that in the Buddhist thing, right? The Buddhist practitioner has first order desires and approves of some and disapproves of the other. Right. So Frankfurt says weakness of will is when you disapprove of a desire, you don't want to act on it, but it's strong and you succumb to it and you act on it. He calls that weakness of will. Right. He says, but when you approve of the certain desires and you only act on the desires that you approve of, he calls that freedom of the will, because you have the kind of structure in your will that you want to have. And another way of talking about it is that there's a harmony between or across the levels or layers of your will. It's sometimes called a hierarchical model of freedom of the will. You have a hierarchical structure in your will, you approve of it. Now, the objection that you're raising, I guess that you might raise to Frankfurt, is even your second order desires are determined, right? Right. So this is the argument about determinism being inconsistent with free will. And I already kind of argued against that. I think that that's a mistake. But here's the thing. As a Buddhist, let's say, I call myself a Buddhist sometimes, and sometimes I say I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a kind of quasi-Buddhist because I can't accept all the doctrines of Buddhism. And there's so many different versions of Buddhism, but there's a lot in the philosophy that I find useful. So the Buddha claims that he can have the kind of thought that he wants to have. He can think a thought that he wants to think and not think a thought that he doesn't want to think. He can have the resolve that he wants to have and not have the resolve that he doesn't want to have. That's something Frankfurt would call freedom of the will. A resolve is a kind of meta level volition that's effective. Right? Like that's my meta level volition, and I'm only going to act on those first order desires that I approve. That's what a resolve is. A resolve is automatically meta volitional, right? It's like I'm committed to this path, volitional path, and I'm going to succeed, and I do succeed, right? I'm resolved. right? So Frankfurt would have to say that the Buddha demonstrates freedom of the will, but that's one conception of freedom of the will. But the Buddha's freedom, like you said, is larger freedom of the mind. It's a kind of space of mental freedom where, from the Buddhist perspective, all your first order mental states, none of them, I should say, determine your behavior because you've escaped from them all. You've deconditioned yourself from all the karmic determination that they came with when you were born in this life, let's just say, with your genetics and your experience and everything else. So this is a different conception of freedom, mental freedom. And I say that the Buddhist model of mental freedom includes freedom of the will as just one small component. Freedom of emotion, freedom of thought, freedom of volition, freedom of identity, freedom of all sorts of kinds of freedom. Even perception. The Buddha claims that he can know whatever he wants to know by putting his attention to it. Almost like omniscience, you know? So I'm not sure if I wiggled around in my answer, if I satisfied your question, because it was a really good question, but that's something that, you know, you can spend a lifetime trying to give a clear account of. And that's what I have a few books on this subject already, and I'm still trying to refine, you know, my response to really good objections. That's a really good question. And look, in meditation practice, if you said you practice meditation, you get into a state of mental freedom, right on the cusp of your agency, when you are awake. Buddha means awake, right? When the smriti in Sanskrit means mindfulness, right? Or wakefulness. It also means remembrance or recognition or intimate familiarity, right? To be familiar with something, you have to recognize it, you have to remember it, you have to already know it. So it's a kind of knowing, it's epistemic, it's a full wakefulness in the mind, right? And you intend to have that when you sit and practice. And then your mind wanders. If you still have karma, your mind wanders, right? And you kind of fall asleep. You forget to be mindful and in the witnessing mode of mental freedom and that kind of clarity of mindfulness, right? And there's a remembering and a forgetting and a remembering and forgetting that, and it's deterministic on some level, right? It's, well, whether it's metaphysically deterministic, let's just say it's caused by your karmic dispositions and your, you know, your volitional history. It's your baggage. It keeps asserting itself, but you're cultivating some control. When every time you forget and realize you forgot and you remember, there's agency there. And my claim, and I think Lou said something about this earlier, is that as your skill grows in this practice, your effectiveness as an agent increases, even though you're becoming more aware that the nature of an agent is some kind of ephemeral process. It's a collection of abilities. It's not an entity or an object. But here's another thing I'd say about that. In almost every branch of science in the last 50 years or so, or 100 years, the ontology of science is becoming more of a process metaphysics, right? Everything is a table is a process, right? And so we say, okay, there's no self though in Buddhism. But then if we're going to say there's no self because it's a process, then we have to say there's no table, there's no nothing, there's no Buddha, right? So there's a kind of asymmetry there. Either the self exists as a process of this agential abilities. That doesn't mean it's an object like a table or a soul, an Atman, a concrete, never-changing thing. So these are some of the other aspects of a more complete sketch of an answer to your question.
It is a thing. What do we name as a self? Maybe this is something that overcomes us when we are in meditation. Something large, not ourself, but this is the end of the way in Buddhism. When we nirvana is I don't know how to
describable, unconditioned.
There is no self, but until the end there is remains of self. Every time we are on the way to but this is the trap. I want to be without self. If I say I want to be without self, that is impossible task.
It's only impossible grammatically. And I
Yes.
think what Rick, to say a different way, in a briefer way, what I think I understood very clearly from Rick's answer to you is that this is achievable. What Rick is describing is achievable through a combination of right understanding, right mindfulness, and also right effort. This is where, in right effort, the experience of perpetuating desirable mind states is attained, and the discouragement of unfavorable mind states is also being practiced. So what arises is what you want to arise, and what does not arise is what you don't want, what you do not want to arise, because that's unwholesome in some way. So I mean, I'm just saying in another way what Rick was saying, but this is explained in the earliest Theravada traditions. Like Nayanta Loka, he gives a very beautiful explanation of this and how it actually operates on us. So the self is a mental formation. That's all. It's a grammatical fiction, but we get very wedded to it to our detriment. Most of the waking day, and often at night when we're asleep. It doesn't stop tormenting us in dreams. But you can control all this. Rick gave a very beautiful sketch, to think of the metaphysics of how that operates, but it's completely consistent with the wisdom of the elders in the very first writings. So I think go back to that, and you'll see. We'll watch the recording. At least we have this much, Rick. So if we revisit your answer and think about it as a conjunction of those three factors in meditation, Robert, then I think it will all click. And you really will forget about yourself until you realize that you're forgetting about yourself. Then, of course, the bubble bursts and you have to start again, reset, But we have the ability to do this, and that's a really great gift from we don't know what origin, but it is truly a great gift, is it not, Rick? The fact that the human consciousness is capable of this is truly amazing, yes?
Yeah.
Rick, would you like to field a question from August? August, welcome. Our friend from the prairies. Are you in Edmonton? Do I have that right? Welcome. Please unmute. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure to see you guys. So Rick, you mentioned Goenka, and then sort of the conversation went elsewhere. So I just wanted to hear if you have done his meditation retreats, the 10-day courses, and if so, what are your thoughts in how this Theravada Burmese Buddhist tradition compares to other stuff you may have experimented with? And if you have experimented with it, have you arrived at that place where you're able to transcend the first order of mental activities that dictate our day-to-day experience?
Well, that's an awful lot. That's a number of questions there. I'll start out with, if I forget, to answer the second or third or fourth part of that question, you'll remind me. But I'll start out with a funny little anecdote about my attempt to take a 10-day retreat with Dhamma.org, DHAMMA, by the way, for those of you who want to take a free 10-day retreat in the Goenka tradition, which is the Theravada, and which is the longest lasting living tradition that goes back to the earliest, the elders. The way of the elders is Theravada, right? So I wanted to take one, and you apply online and you fill out a form, and they ask you about your reasons why and what practices you have and this sort of thing. And I remember filling it out and saying, well, I've been practicing meditation for decades. I've been teaching my students meditation for decades. I teach yoga and meditation in various places, in wellness centers and hospitals and this and that. And it's one of the most important things in my life. But I've always, I learned mindfulness from Daniel Goldman, who took a course with the Goenka folks in Bodh Gaya back in the 70s, along with Ram Dass and blah, 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 blah. These are my teachers. I went through the whole thing. And they said, oh, it'd be great. You should come. But they told me, look, just so you know, the guy called me and we had a phone call conversation. And he said, you need to know in advance that when you're done with this retreat, we will discourage you from teaching meditation unless you continue with us and, our elders validate you as someone who's qualified to teach meditation in our tradition. And I remember, and I was like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to stop teaching my students. It's very helpful. And I teach yoga classes. I teach it all over. I've been teaching thousands of people meditation already for many years. And the guy said, oh, well, you could still come to the retreat, maybe it'll change your mind. And I thought, no, that would be intellectually dishonest of me. I know that I'm not going to change my mind. I was just coming for a 10-day retreat, not to be recruited into, the lineage. And he kept arguing with me. And I thought, this seems very weird. Like, you're rationalizing me being unethical according to my own standards. Let's part ways now. So I never went, but I have respect. I know many people who've gone. I've had many teachers who came through that. Like I mentioned, a few of them already. I've been practicing a lot of those techniques throughout my life. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you've been here for the whole call, but so that's my experience with the Goenka tradition. And I've had, like, what was her name? Ruth Dennison. Her name is Dhammadena. I took teaching from her. She was one of Goenka's students, direct, immediate students. I think the two of them might have been disciples of the same Mahasi, whatever his name was. Actually, to be honest, yeah, she was a spiritual sibling of Goenka's. So I have a lot of respect and love for that tradition. It just, I never followed through with it, and I have more of an eclectic practice. And I've never taken a step back to compare my spiritual evolution and my states of attainment according to some kind of metric that the Theravadins have, as a stream entry, this, that. I've had all sorts of experiences that don't match up with the way that they say these should happen in this sequence. I remember that fellow whose book I read, that colleague of mine who recommended Plato Not Prozac to me. He told me that he had an out-of-body experience where he went out of the top of his head, and he had a Buddhist teacher who told him that couldn't happen to you yet because you're not at this level yet. You couldn't have gone out the top of your head. You had to come out of your forehead or something like that. And I remember thinking, these models, look, Buddha was a heterodox philosopher in an orthodox environment. And every single branch of Buddhism was a heterodox version relative to the version that came before it. And almost every religion, every form of spirituality, every kind of martial art, every kind of yoga, and every kind of philosophy involves this heresy. And I like this kind of heresy. So I'm almost averse to these kinds of metrics and systems that say, oh no, these are the absolutely necessary foundations of mindfulness. And if you don't start here, you're going to screw up along the way and this and that. And like, look, if you're in that tradition and you beloved guru and all that, that's wonderful. Good for you, just not for me.
Okay.
So I don't know if I answered all the questions there, August. Was
Yeah,
there what I missed?
great questions and a great answer, Rick. We're going to take a couple of more questions. Okay, we're running later than we usually do because we started a little later than we usually do, but it's really fascinating, and everyone is pretty much sticking around. So let's take a couple of more questions, okay, if you're willing, and then we'll call it a day. All right, Bill, do you have a question this time around? Not about the time zones, but maybe about the philosophy.
Okay. Do you agree that you should be free to think, even though you got these things, there's all these, I'm not anti-Buddhist, but I've become skeptical of things. I'm not anti too much, but is it more right, okay, to be free to be? You don't have to just choose. It's okay. You don't have to bow to the authorities if you're free to be. Do you see what I mean? Because you're talking like it's okay, you're validating that.
I think my approach in general is to just say yes. You are not required to outsource your moral, existential, spiritual, or philosophical compass to any other human being, no matter what their name is. Socrates, Buddha, Guru, Jesus, it doesn't matter. You have to trust your own inner philosopher. That's the bottom line. I think that's an axiom of philosophical counseling, is that we want to help our clients, our interlocutors, to do precisely that. That's the foundation of the whole philosophy practice movement.
Wonderfully put, Rick. I'm going to ask maybe if anyone else has a question for you. We could take one more question, and there are several in the room who haven't yet piped up. So now's an opportunity to grab the mic and to interact with Rick before we call it a day. Karen has joined us. Hi, Karen. Would anyone like to ask a last question, or should we just give Rick the last word here? Henry, by all means. Henri.
Hey, Rick, finally, for the first time, I speak up here. Wonderful meetings, by the way, everyone. It's just a great pleasure to learn a lot here. Rick, you have such an armamentarium from which to choose when you're doing your counseling. How and what do you use? What's your compass that you use to pull the right tool with your client?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just trying to place you in my memory. You're in California, aren't you?
Yes, I'm a physician, medical ethicist, and
an author,
and sort of an author. And so I'm.
I remember meeting you in this space at least once.
Yes.
Before. Yeah. So, it's funny. I've been, I'm one of the directors and VPs of APPA now. And because of that, I've been motivated to take all the trainings, because eventually I'll have to be giving them to others. And one of them is the second level counseling thing, where you have to write up 5 to 10 of your own cases and then describe what you do and how you did it and all that sort of thing, what your methodology was. And then one of the other people in APPA, I think it's mainly Lydia, who takes charge of this, who will be the supervisor. So you're under supervision and you discuss them with her and everything. So I haven't handed them over yet because I'm not really happy with them. But I've been engaging in this reflective process of what is it that I do and trying to describe that. And well, what I've come up with is that I don't really do anything. I think that I got the training to not do anything when I was in Gestalt, because they have this attitude about the client is coming in when they're out of contact with reality. You need to be totally present. They're an unraveling onion with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and whatever emerges is what's valid in the moment. And you should be more listening to it, and then just kind of be present and bring whatever emerges in the Gestalt. You want to kind of create a dynamic field with that person, create trust. And I just kind of use my intuition. And that's what I was doing when I was doing Gestalt as the therapist. And I can't help but have the same attitude as a philosopher. It depends on what comes in. I have some clients who come to me and want to have discussions like, I forget the fellow's name. He left already. August, was it August? Somebody asked me about free will. I forget. Oh, no, it was Robert. It depends. So I have clients who've contacted me because they know I write about free will and they're confused about it, or about meditation. So it depends on what it is. I have people who come and just want to debate and discuss and engage with a philosophical mind. Some people come in with these existential or personal, like, they're going through it. Should I leave my partner after 8 years, or should I change my career? Or, it depends on what the issue is, what kinds of things will seem relevant to me. But you're right. I have a kind of a big, like if I was an artist, I'd have a lot of different, colors. If every psychotechnology is a color, I've got a whole big palette of different colors. And whatever comes, what seems appropriate, I'll try it. This is another attitude in Gestalt. Have the attitude that whatever you bring in as a potential intervention to move the client in some way is a brainstorming experiment. It's just a hypothesis. And it either seems like it's resonating and landing, or it doesn't, and be very flexible and fluid about that. So that's my overall. I have a kind of meta level dynamic. That's the way that I approach these things. It's not like, oh, I've got I don't know if you know Searle's Chinese room experiment, where the symbols come in and they're Chinese, and there's a kiosk. And the question is, does the kiosk actually understand Chinese? But in there's a guy who's got a list of symbols called inputs and a list of symbols next to them called outputs. And when everything gets pushed into the input, he looks it up and finds it on the list, finds the output and puts the output out, right? So he seems to be that the kiosk speaks and understands Chinese, but it doesn't. He's just matching things, right? So I would imagine that some counselors or therapists have some kind of input-output algorithms like that, where if this is the problem, it's Nietzsche, or if that's the problem, it's Plato, that kind of thing. And it's probably good to have that sort of thing, but I don't have that. I just, I have everything I know, and whatever seems relevant, that's what comes up. So I don't know if that's sloppy, Lou, and I don't know if Lydia is going to like that when I hand over my descriptions of my cases.
Rick, I think Livia's going to love it, and I also do. Henri, that's a great question, and it's a question that, Henri, your question, or Henry, your question has been posed by a lot of journalists trying to understand philosophical counseling, because they really demand a method. If you're a psychologist, you can tell them, oh, you're a Freudian or a Jungian or an Adlerian, or you can shoehorn somebody into a box before they walk into your office. You have a method. It's all set up, and you're going to process them like the Chinese room without necessarily understanding anything about them. It's true. And that sometimes makes people feel like they're not really interacting with anybody. They're just being treated as a guinea pig or a rat running a maze. And at the end of it, there might be well-being that comes out of it. The piece of cheese is they feel better or not. But the most successful practitioners, either they do one of two things, I think. They either operate with a method which is so beautiful, so elegant, so powerful that it really does work in a lot of cases, like Pierre's philosophical midwifery. I mean, it's a very powerful model, but it is so deep that it really is very beautiful and artfully done as Pierre does it. You could talk about the inner...
Lou,
Yeah.
Let me reject. Yeah. But it only seems relevant to me if I get the impression that what I'm dealing with is a hidden pathologos. That's not often the case. Sometimes
Exactly.
it's
No,
just, yeah.
That's where we probably disagree, because as wonderful as Pierre is, he tends to believe, or at least his followers do, that it's good for everything, and I disagree with that. It really depends on what the person's presenting. So the inner philosopher model that you alluded to earlier is very effective, because we're trying to discover who the client is, what kind of philosopher's in the room with us. And if that inner philosopher is sleeping in the client, it's our job to wake it up. So only when we wake it up do we really know what kind of method would have been appropriate if we were methodologists. But by eschewing method, we make much better successes, because we use the method of no method. And that, I think, is the other option. So I like Rick, like you, I like to have a lot of tools in the toolkit. You paint with a really broad and multicolored brush. And honestly, I think that's the best way, because there's no prejudgment about who's coming to talk to you about what. Is that work for you, Henry? So if we can suspend judgment, then we can actually hear and understand a lot better. I think that's how you work, Rick, is it not?
Yeah. And I think there's cognitive science and artificial intelligence, all those fields kind of converge on the idea that a human rationality is not algorithmic, right? It's just not. So, we need to be more flexible, especially when you're dealing with this kind of work.
Yeah, more intuitive.
Yeah.
And
tacit knowledge, relevance realization. A robot can't read a salience landscape and pluck out what's relevant. That's just something that's wisdom that's accumulated through experience, right? That's skill.
Right. And it's an art form.
Not algorithmic. Yeah.
What we're doing is an art form. Would you not agree, Rick? If we're doing a science, then there would be an algorithm or a methodology. But if it's an art form, then we really can't in advance describe it. We can do it, but we can't predict what it's going to be. Rick, I think we could wrap things up for today. It's been really wonderful to have you as our featured guest, and the fact that everyone is sticking around is evidence of that. So I really do want to thank you a lot. And we're going to end up having a really wonderful recording of what we recorded. So thank you all for coming. And Rick, you've shared a lot of very rich experiences and insights with us. I'm really grateful for that. And I wouldn't worry about Lydia. She'll love your case studies. You know that.
I was just kidding.
Yeah. So listen, everyone, let's give Rick a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation, and very insightful. And we'll get some version of this up on YouTube for those who will want to watch it. Thank you again, Rick, and thank you all for coming. Next month, we'll welcome Professor Ozdemir. You'll get the email. It'll be the 24th of June. But Rick, it's been wonderful to get a chance to interact today, and thanks again from all of us for being here.
Thank you all.